Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Harambe. Tonight we open our program from the campus of Lehigh University, a college with a long and rich tradition of academic excellence. And if you walk this campus long enough, you'll most assuredly see the faces of African American students. And you'll probably see the faces of African American male students as well. But the reality of the situation is, in all too many cases, too many young African American men are finding themselves on this kind of campus in this kind of dormitory, the campus of the local prison. There are roughly 537,000 African American men enrolled in colleges and universities throughout the U.S., contrasted by 583,000 African American men locked up and locked down in cells just like this one. Black males in the U.S. are incarcerated at the rate 4 times the rate of black males under the South African apartheid regime. According to the Sentencing Project, a Washington, D.C. based research agency that tracks incarceration rates, the estimated cost of locking up African American men alone is nearly $12 billion a year. Across all races, there are 1.3 million Americans locked up, double the amount just 10 years ago. The cost to us taxpayers? $27 billion a year. $27 billion a year. At the same time, crime is also big business. You don't think so? Well, just look at your local or network news on any given day, and if that's not enough crime to whet your appetite, cheaply produced network primetime programs such as Day One, Primetime Live, Dateline NBC, 2020, 48 Hours, and the like carry a steady stream of features that depict crime, usually perpetrated by inner city blacks. Factor in a depressing season of political elections with just about every politician pimping off crime, and you get the picture. Are we being overwhelmed by the exploitation of crime? Or is crime really significantly up over, say, 10, 20 years ago? What role is drugs and crack cocaine playing in black men going to prison? And why is it that you can't watch the evening news without seeing black men in handcuffs, yet statistics indicate that whites represent 7 out of every 10 people arrested in the United States? Is it justice or just us? Mark Maurer is Assistant Director of the Sentencing Project.
Mark, what does your statistics show for arrest rates by race as contrasted with the incarceration rate by race?
Well, we've seen in some of our studies we've done nationally that on any given day now, 1 in 4 young African American males is under some type of criminal justice supervision, either in prison, jail, probation, or parole. If we look overall, we see there are more black men in prison and jail than there are in college these days, and clearly it has some very serious implications. There's a whole question, of course, about, is this evidence of racism within the criminal justice system? Is this a racist society outside? To what extent does race play a role in creating some of these disparities? I think the answer is a complex one. I think racism does exist in the criminal justice system, just as it does in all our institutions. I think it's also a question of issues of race and class coming together, that by and large, if we look at our prison system, it's low-income people of all races are the ones who are incarcerated, and we tend to have a two-tiered system of justice almost. We've known for a long time, you get the best justice money can buy, but probably more importantly, for those people of means, we have a social service network and system that deals with their problems much more so than for low-income people, for whom the criminal justice system becomes a much more common experience.
Mark, I recently saw some statistics that originated from Jesse Jackson's group, the Rainbow Coalition, which indicated that 69% of all people arrested in the United States are whites. Yet I believe African Americans make up roughly about 50%
of the prison population, yeah.
So that's an accurate assessment?
Yeah. I think we've seen that whites do make up a strong majority of those who are arrested, and blacks now make up just about half of the prison population. The situation is somewhat complex in analyzing it, since blacks are arrested disproportionately for violent offenses, which are more likely to result in a prison term. But I think the biggest growth we've seen in the prison population in recent years has been due to the war on drugs, and there I think there's no question that this has disproportionately had an impact on the African American community, far out of proportion to their drug use.
Now, you watch the evening news every night, particularly local news, and you just see crime story after crime story after crime story, violent crime in particular. Mark, is violent crime really that much on the increase, or is it on the increase? And how does the preponderance of violent crime stack up to, say, 10 or 20 years ago?
Our rates of violent crime in this country are not much different than they were 10 years ago. These kinds of things go up a little and down a little, but the murder rate is probably the best indication. The murder rate has been more or less steady for almost the last 20 years or so. Now, one of the reasons that people sometimes think the violence is going up is because many adults can remember back to their childhood, and you think back 30 years, and it's true, there was less violence and less crime 30 years ago. And of course, we're concerned about that, and we do have a high rate of violence in this country. But I think we need some sense of proportion. The fact that violent crime has not gotten worse in the last 10 years should have us call into question what kinds of policies we need to do to respond to this. Now, the one area where things have gotten somewhat worse is in some of the juvenile violence, and a lot of that has to do with the availability of guns for younger and younger children, something you just don't see in any other industrialized country.
Well, what is the Sentencing Project's position on mandatory sentences?
Well, we think that no two crimes, no two offenders or offenses are alike, and that legislatures can never know all the circumstances that need to be taken into account in setting penalties, and you need to have some discretion built into the system. We have all sorts of mandatory penalties for drug offenses in particular that have been passed in recent years, and which basically means that a drug kingpin flying in plane loads of drugs from South America is treated the same as a housewife who gets on a bus and delivers a small quantity of cocaine to someone else. Now, they both committed a crime, they both need to be punished, but clearly the punishment should be a very different nature for these two individuals. Mandatory sentencing takes away the ability of judges to make those kinds of distinctions that any reasonable person would think are very appropriate. We're constantly trying to talk with criminal justice policymakers, elected officials, and the public about what works and what doesn't work in controlling crime. You know, the bottom line is everybody is tough on crime. Everybody wants to do something about crime. We've had far too much political rhetoric that doesn't have much substance behind it. What we've been doing is research, and we basically try to look at what impact prison has on crime, what are the limitations of the criminal justice system, and then looking at other fields. How do we evaluate prevention programs? How do we know if midnight basketball is going to have an impact on crime? Is Head Start the way to go? You know, what combination of social programs, what combination of economic changes are necessary to begin to have some type of impact? I think we know generally that the best way to deal with crime is to build strong families and communities, and we have a variety of problems in our communities these days.
Is building more jails the answer?
Well, we have more than twice as many people in our prison system today as we did 10 years ago. I don't know anybody who feels safer today than they did 10 years ago, and the crime statistics bear this out as well. One of the problems we have, the reason why prison doesn't work to slow down the rate of crime, is that crime is sort of a young man's game disproportionately. It's young males in the 15 to 18 year age group commit a disproportionate amount of crime. Well, the average inmate in prison is about 30 years old, so he or she is sort of on the downside of their criminal career. Meanwhile, every year we've got a whole new generation of 14 and 15-year-olds entering those high crime rate years, and unless we do something on the front end in the way of prevention and working with young people and young families, we're missing the boat by just building prisons on the back end and locking them up after the fact, after the damage has been done.
Congress recently passed a $30 billion crime bill that was hotly contested within the 40-member Congressional Black Caucus. Even though caucus chairman Kweisi Mfume lobbied hard and won support of 27 members of the CBC, heavy hitters such as Maxine Waters, Charlie Rangel, Ron Dellums, and John Conyers voted against the bill, mainly due to death penalty provisions. Reverend Jesse Jackson on the new crime bill.
The crime bill is a crime. It's a combination of Kool-Aid and cyanide. It will not reduce crime. What it will do, however, is give a boom to the prison industry. The number one urban industry is jails. Number one public housing project for this administration is jails. And as they privatize these jails, and sheriffs can buy stock in the public corporations, they get money according to the number of people in jail, full occupancy, like hotels. This is vulgar. It's insane. We would do far better to focus on 4 balls in your own than 3 strikes and you're out. Prenatal care and Head Start, ball 1. An adequately funded public education, ball 2. A marketable skill, ball 3, and a job, ball 4. It's clear to me that prenatal care, Head Start, and daycare on the front side makes more sense and is more cost efficient than jail care and welfare on the back side.
I think despite the rhetoric we've heard about the crime bill being a mix of punishment and prevention, it's primarily a punishment and policing bill, and only a relatively modest portion of its funding going to prevention programs. There's a total of about $10 billion in there for prison construction, which is going to be funneled out to the states to respond to their overcrowding crisis and to start building prisons. We estimate that this could be somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 new prison cells that might be constructed with this money. On top of that, there are provisions in the bill or incentives for state to get some of this money by increasing their penalties in a number of areas so that certain inmates would serve a longer period of time in prison. And then this will exacerbate the problem, create a need for even more additional prison space down the road. So it's a very substantial expansion of the prison system that we're talking about as a result of this bill.
Do you think the fact that the crime bill, the recently passed crime bill, the fact that it was characterized in the media as midnight basketball really detracted from the substance of that bill?
Yeah. I think what's unfortunate is that, like it or not, midnight basketball was just a very small portion of the overall crime bill. I don't know that we have any strong evaluations yet about whether or not it's successful in reducing crime. My feeling is, anything we do to provide recreation to young people, to give them some sense of self-esteem, to deal with problems they have, is very beneficial, even if it didn't have any impact on crime. It's the kind of thing that we need. But I think the opponents of some of the prevention programs painted this all out of proportion. I don't think anybody who supports or runs a midnight basketball program thinks that this is the answer to crime. I think midnight basketball, along with a host of other kinds of things, may be part of the way we get at this. But we need to be doing these things because they're the right thing to do anyway, and they're part of the whole mix of dealing with the crime problem.
What about President Clinton's proposal of 3 strikes and you're out?
Well, 3 strikes and you're out is probably the most popular thing in the criminal justice legislative field these days. It's not going to have any substantial impact on crime, and it may threaten to bankrupt state budgets and the federal system as well. There's no shortage of harsh sentencing laws already in the book for people who commit serious crimes, murders, rapes, armed robberies. Those people, by and large, are already going to prison for a substantial amount of time. What these laws are going to do are make sure that some of these people, and in many cases much less serious offenders, will be spending the rest of their lives behind bars. So we'll have inmates who are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s in geriatric prisons at a cost of upwards of $60,000 a year for elderly inmates. It's money in prison space that obviously could be used either to house younger or more violent offenders or to engage in prevention programs or whatever else might have an impact on crime. But it's from a cost-benefit point of view, it's a very irrational thing to be doing to fight crime.
Mark, what do you think of the new move to privatize the prison system?
Well, there is clearly a movement to privatizing prisons that's been going on. I think something like 2% of the prisons in the country are now run by private companies. I think there are some potential dangers inherent in this whole movement. One is that the private companies say they can do it more cheaply and more efficiently. I think it remains to be seen if that's true. If they can't do it more cheaply, we'd like to know how that is. Are they cutting back on services? Is it that they don't permit labor unions? There are a variety of ways that don't necessarily help the local community that might cut down on costs. I think the other area of concern is that even though they're housing state inmates and are responsible to state standards, I think any time you turn over a function of the state, a public function, to private enterprise, it puts it sort of one step removed from scrutiny by the legislature and by the courts. We've seen the history of prisons have been full of abuses from day one, and I think it's our obligation to observe what's going on in the prisons, whether they're public or private, and do that as closely as possible.
We'll be back with more Harambe right after this Black Facts. Stay with us. If you visit prisons, as I sometimes do, one striking contrast you may notice is the prison population is significantly black. The prison guards and corrections officials are overwhelmingly white. And when you factor in attorneys, judges, probation parole officers, and other ancillary functions, you get the sense of a huge industry. Is the criminal justice system big business?
I think there's no question that prisons have become big business, anywhere from the vending machine companies that put soda machines in the waiting rooms to the prison construction and the architects and everybody in between. If you look through publications of the American Correctional Association, the professional group, you see page after page of advertisements for fancy electronic doors and handcuffs and drug testing machines and all sorts of things like this. So there clearly are some very powerful, very vested interest in this whole experience. I'm not as convinced as some people, though, that most of the drive to build new prisons is completely driven by these economic interests. I think maybe less so than we might have seen with the military-industrial complex. I think a lot of it may begin there, but it's egged on by politicians, by the media, who find it beneficial for their own individual interests to pursue this sort of get tough policy. And once we get involved in this vicious cycle, it's very hard to get away from it. It's very hard to introduce any rational discussion at that point.
One major factor triggering the increase in incarceration of primarily young African-American men is crack cocaine, which mysteriously emerged in the mid-1980s in the African-American community. Congress passed legislation in 1988 requiring mandatory sentences for those convicted of crack cocaine, usually blacks, while those convicted of powdered cocaine, likely to be whites, receive substantially less harsh sentences. Reverend Jesse Jackson.
If you're caught with 5 grams of crack cocaine, that's 5 sweet and low sugar bags, about $8 high, 5 years mandatory federal prison. If you're caught with 500 grams of powdered cocaine, you can walk. What's the difference? The $8 high, 93% of the rest are young black males. The powder cocaine, 75% of the rest are white males. And so one goes to jail, first-time offense, non-violent offender, the other can walk. That's unfair, and it's racial. And we deserve racial justice and equal protection under the law, and we're not getting it.
Well, the cocaine sentencing disparity problem goes back to the mid-1980s, I think particularly after the death of Len Bias, the University of Maryland basketball star, for overdosing on crack. There was a great national hysteria about the problem. And tragic as his case was, what this led Congress to do was to pass some very severe sentencing laws for possession of very small amounts of crack cocaine. And what we see now is that the penalty for possessing 5 grams of crack cocaine is a mandatory 5 years in prison. For cocaine powder, it requires 100 times that amount, or 500 grams, before you get the same 5 years. I think all the evidence has shown us that these are two forms of the same drugs. They're ingested in different ways, but it's completely irrational to say that we should have a disparity of 100 to 1 in how we treat these in the system. And of course, as we've seen, the implementation of the laws, it's completely correlated with race, and it's led to contributing to racial disparities that we see in the criminal justice system.
This is a very sensitive area because we're talking about primarily young black men being incarcerated for long periods of time while their white counterparts are able to avail themselves of college educations. It's important to understand is that crack cocaine is the only drug of which simple possession carries a mandatory minimum penalty. The only drug. Simple possession of any other drug, the person can get probation, and it is a misdemeanor. Simple possession of crack is a felony. Something is not quite right here. What is happening? One of the things I have seen in observing some of the court cases is that the FBI agents who arrest persons under these laws are doing it in a discriminatory fashion. They are refusing to accept in their undercover deals a powder cocaine sale from a young black man. They are ordering that suspect to cook the powder cocaine into crack. Once it's cooked into crack, then they arrest them and charge them under the harsher crack laws. You have thousands of first-time nonviolent persons who get caught up in the snares of this wide net which has been cast on this particular issue, who, because this law mandates an automatic sentence, the judge has no discretion whatsoever to give any other type of sentence. The person has to serve 5 years, has to serve 15 years, has to serve 20 years, even if the person has never been convicted of an offense before, even if there are other types of mitigating circumstances involved with the situation. We're talking about equity. We're not talking about not punishing people who have committed crimes. We're talking about letting the punishment fit the crime and not let the punishment be discriminatory. Drug kingpins usually serve less time than the so-called mules or the couriers or the lower level participant in the drug operation. And why is that? It's because under the mandatory minimum sentence, if the defendant has information to trade, to give to the prosecutor on other drug dealers or the intricacies of the drug operation, then he or she is able to get a lesser sentence. The low-level drug offender, which is usually that crack addict or crack dealer on the street, who is not high up in the drug operation, gets slapped on him or her the full amount of the time because they have no information to trade. So you have an ironic situation where the poor people, the people who are very low in the whole scheme, are the ones languishing in prison. What happens when nonviolent drug abusers are in the prisons under mandatory minimum sentences? Violent offenders, those who are murderers and rapists and the like, who are not subject to mandatory minimum sentences, will have to be let out the back door of the prison because there will be no room for them.
But there is no question that when you talk about cocaine, where you find the majority of the Americans that use that, they're non-black, they're non-Hispanic, they're affluent people. And so therefore, in the minds of those people that are enacting the law, they are not the ones that are committing the common crimes. When it comes to crack, everyone knows it's an inner city problem. And so to give more time to the people who have less influence, who are poor, who have less income, less jobs, and less hope for the future, clearly is not based on equal justice under the law. And so I have legislation in to say drugs are drugs, abusers are abusers, and criminals are criminals. But what difference does it make which form of crack are you using? So if those who pick it out and call it racist I don't see how anyone can dispute that.
I'd like to ask you if there's ever been any legislation proposed that would get into using foreign policy or cutting off foreign aid to those drug-producing countries that we know about. Has that ever been attempted?
I introduced this bill as soon as I got here in the mid-'70s. It's passed. It's called the Rangel-Rodino Amendment, that every country that receives any type of assistance, foreign aid, military, technical, has to every year be reviewed by the State Department to determine what efforts are they making to stop the production and the trafficking of drugs. The problem is that it is the State Department that refuses to enforce the law.
It should be noted that harsher sentences for crack as opposed to powder cocaine only apply to federal laws and not necessarily to state and local laws. Also, cocaine sentencing disparity is currently under review by Congress, and we'll keep you posted on the outcome. Several other points must also be made. I think it's safe to say that you'll find no sympathy for crime of any color within the African American community. And although what causes crime was not the scope of this program, it needs to be said that too often the cause of crime has been framed on mainstream media within the context of family values, conveniently overlooking realities such as white flight and the abandonment of our cities and the associated eroded tax base, the substandard quality of education most inner city students receive, and worst of all, the exportation of American manufacturing jobs, all of which have a profound effect on opportunities and crime. And as you've just seen, one prevailing reason why so many African American men are going to prison is drugs, which prompts me to pose a question to you that was recently posed to me by a young African American man. He said, why is it that in our country, which has the most sophisticated international intelligence apparatus in the world, has done such an anemic job with preventing drugs from entering our country and destroying the fabric of our society? We know who the drug-producing countries are. Most of them receive hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign aid from the United States every year. And lastly, do you know of any cases where African Americans are flying drugs in this country or smuggling drugs in by boat? Are African Americans financing these drug cartels or laundering the money? And with so many black men behind bars, are African Americans even profiting off of their own collective misery? Why is it that African Americans are disproportionately the ones who are going to prison? Is it justice or just us? Good night, everybody.